countries in the Middle East are openly attacking each other now. All this takes really is a miscalculation for the whole thing to kind of collapse.
I'm David Knowles, and this is Battle Lines.
I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
This week on Battle Lines, we look at assassinations in the Middle East that raise fears of a wider war throughout the region amid chaos in the state of Israel. Then, we look at the Venezuelan elections that many claim were far from free and fair. This week, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran. His killing came directly after Hezbollah leader Fouad Shakur was killed in a rare Israeli strike on Beirut. Both moves greatly raise the fears of a wider war across the Middle East. We speak to the Telegraph's Paul Nuki and James Rothwell to find out more. Well, Paul and James, thank you so much for your time. There's a lot to talk about in Israel and the region this week. James, can I come to you first? Which of the assassinations have you been looking at?
I've been looking at the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, who is the political leader of Hamas. This was a sort of earth-shaking moment for the Israeli state. We've known for a very long time that they're capable of reaching out and striking their enemies abroad. But it was more the location of this assassination rather than the person themselves that was particularly surprising. Haniyeh was assassinated in the heart of Iran. This is, along with Doha and Qatar, perhaps the one place in the Middle East where he would have expected to have total security. And for me, what I think is really kind of astonishing about this actually is the fact that they were able to reach him there. This really is what you would consider to be, at least prior to this war, the sort of stronghold, of course, not just of the Iranian regime, but also the kind of, it's basically symbolic of basic fundamental stuff about statecraft, such as the ability to protect your allies on your own soil. I think it was quite interesting that many outraged Iranian officials yesterday were talking about they almost sounded horrified in the way that they were talking about the fact that one of their guests had been killed. But that's the much more kind of trenchant issue here is not that he was a guest. He was actually supposed to be under the protection, not just of his own bodyguard, but also the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And it speaks to very deep concerns on their side about perhaps how badly infiltrated Iran has been by Israeli intelligence services. I should stress that Israel has not claimed direct responsibility for this killing. I think it's unlikely that they will. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, did not mention that assassination when he gave a press conference yesterday. He spoke about direct strikes in Yemen. He spoke about their retaliatory response to a senior Hezbollah commander in Lebanon, but he didn't mention this one. I think he knows that would probably be a sort of red line if he did admit responsibility for it. This is part of a long-running sort of policy of Israel of constructive ambiguity when it talks about some of its assassinations abroad. And I think basically that the Iranians are talking a lot about how outraged they are that this guest was assassinated, but that belies a much deeper problem, which is that they seem to be unable to protect allies on their own soil. We know that this regime for many years now has been struggling with a lot of internal dissent. It had to brutally suppress an uprising in 2022. The criticism has been leveled at them that they are perhaps too busy beating up women who don't wear the right headscarf and not busy enough trying to protect some of these people. It potentially opens the door to more assassinations in Iran. And it's a huge moment. We can also talk a bit later on about how Iran might react to this as well.
Before we talk about these other assassinations then, James, as you said, this guy was assassinated. He was a guest of the Iranian regime who's supposed to be protected by his bodyguards and by the Iranians as well. Do we have any sense of how this was accomplished? How was this done?
There's some conflicting reports as to how exactly this assassination was carried out. There's been a suggestion that maybe a missile was fired from outside of Iranian territory. There's been a suggestion that it may even have been fired from a building that was adjacent or very close to the place where Haniyeh had been staying. There are other possibilities as well. This is purely my speculation, but they may have been able, whoever did it, if it was the Israelis, may have been able to turn someone. They probably acquired intelligence, not just about where he was at that moment in time, but where his movements that day were going to be. Just a few hours ago, oddly enough, he was attending the inauguration ceremony of Iran's new president. Let's not forget that just a few months ago, the previous leader of Iran was killed in a very mysterious helicopter crash. That appears to have been an accident, although, of course, one never really knows in these circumstances. So he went from walking around Tehran, shaking hands with top Iranian officials, to being assassinated in the capital, which is just extraordinary. It's the sort of thing as a journalist that sometimes you wake up and see the news and you can't believe the headlines. They seem so shocking, really, and this is one of those cases. If it was Israel, and like I said, it does appear to have been Israel, from their side, it's a pretty extraordinary coup. It speaks to their prowess in being able to reach out and touch people, which is the phrase that Israeli officials often use in this context. But it was also so bold. The decision to kill him there rather than in another country, which may have been slightly less of a sort of escalatory context, speaks to not just a boldness, but perhaps in the eyes of Netanyahu's critics, a certain recklessness as well. And the big concern now is what the Iranian response to this will be. There's concerns about a regional war breaking out. I should stress that Iran has shown itself to be very cautious over many years in terms of these sorts of crises, and it hasn't shown much appetite for joining the war directly. Although, of course, we can also talk about the Iranian missile barrage back in April against Israel. That was direct action, although it was very carefully choreographed to avoid any major casualties or damage. That's something that we could think about if we're trying to puzzle out what the future Iranian response might be. But it feels like an incredibly dangerous, explosive moment in a shadow war that's been going on between these two countries for many years.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, James, for talking us through that. Paul, can I come to you? As James said, this wasn't the only assassination that we need to talk about. What are some of the others? Who are they? Why? What happened? And why is it important?
So we had the assassination earlier this week in Lebanon, so in the capital, Beirut, of Hezbollah's number 2. And that was as a direct response to the missile which hit the soccer field in the Druze village in the Golan Heights. That, I think, is much more of a tit for tat that can be explained and balanced out. And although Hezbollah denies responsibility for the outrage in the Golan Heights, it's pretty clear that they were responsible, albeit almost certainly an accident, rather than a deliberate targeting of children. But a major assassination nonetheless. I think it is the attack on Tehran that will dictate what happens over the next few weeks and months. Iran has already made clear that it will respond directly, just as it did to the previous attack on what it regarded as its sovereign territory in Syria. And I don't think that it can really back down from that. I think the really big question now is, will CENTCOM, the US alliance, which includes Britain, France, a couple of other Western powers, but crucially also Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE, access to their airspace, will that alliance hold together in defending Israel against any attack that Iran mounts? And that, I think, is going to be quite a test. The Israelis are already saying that they don't think all the Arab nations will stick with it. Jordan was pretty strong in its condemnation of the assassination in Tehran. Qatar yesterday, the Prime Minister was also pretty strong in his condemnation, making the point that here we are trying to negotiate a peace and the Israeli side assassinates the other side's chief negotiator. So it's going to be quite a challenge, I think, to see how America mounts that defense of Israel. And you've got to remember, it was only last week that Netanyahu was in Washington giving his speech to Congress and getting a pretty clear message, I think, certainly from the Democrats' side, that they're losing patience with him. So it's quite difficult to know how this strike in Tehran relate to that visit to Washington. Is it a political response by Netanyahu saying, look, we really are at war with Iran, like I've been telling you? Or is it a bit of military opportunism opportunism, which often drives these assassinations. That is to say that the military get good intelligence, the opportunity to assassinate someone they've long been after. We can't waste that. We've got to move now. And that is certainly what is thought to have driven the attack in Syria in April. That military opportunism, which actually I think was regretted on the part of the Israeli political establishment after the fact.
Also on Thursday, Israel confirmed it had killed Mohammed Deif, the head of the Hamas military wing, during an airstrike back in July in Gaza. And that's another major assassination and a big goal for the Israeli war effort, which set itself the task of killing Mohammed Deif and Ismail Haniyeh. And that means that just one name remains on the, if you like, kill list that the Israeli government now has, which is that of Yahya Sinwar. He's the head of Hamas in Gaza. He's believed to be the strategic mastermind, if you will, of the October 7th attacks. Israel still has not managed to capture or kill him. He's evaded them for 10 months, and it is likely that efforts by the Israeli military will now intensify to try and track him down and kill him as well, completing a very significant part of their war goals in Gaza if they are able to do so.
Paul and James, last week on Battle Lines, we spoke a lot about the potential for the violence across the Middle East to become a regional war. If we've got strikes in Tehran and Lebanon and in Israel as well, to some extent, are we already there? What is left to escalate at this point?
Yes, I think to some extent we are already there. If you step back and look at this, we're talking about a situation where countries in the Middle East are openly attacking each other now, and yet it hasn't escalated to full-scale warfare. And I agree with Paul's point that he made earlier, that this is straining a sort of nascent security pact that's emerging, not just among Western countries, but also Arab states like Jordan. And a big question is whether that's sustainable in the long term. There may be an Iranian response to the assassination of Haniyeh that involves a retread, basically, of April, where a huge barrage of missiles will be fired, possibly directly from Iran, maybe by some of Iran's proxies, such as Lebanon or the Houthis in Syria. And that will require a coordinated response that will not just be very complicated and very costly in terms of various militaries coming to Israel's aid, but it also requires political goodwill. And the attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus that, if you like, provoked the April barrage from Iran just doesn't feel as it doesn't feel quite as daring or bold, as reckless as this new assassination. I think it calls for and demands, perhaps in itself, a sort of stronger mode of retaliation from Iran. Now, whether that means more missiles being fired or whether that means they try something even more extreme, such as perhaps an attempted targeted assassination of someone in Israel, we're not sure, but it will be a bigger challenge for those countries. It may stretch the willingness, particularly of Jordan, which is not overly comfortable in the position it's currently in. It walks a very delicate balance in terms of its own national interests and its kind of tacit support of Israel militarily. And it may not want to continue doing that in the long run. And all this takes really is a miscalculation for the whole thing to kind of collapse. And that, I think, is what everyone is very concerned about.
I think it's very important to stress the importance of that airspace, because these missile barrages come a long way, and Jordan, parts of Saudi Arabia, are really crucial to stopping them. If they withdraw their support, the defense of Israel becomes much, much more difficult. And that could really result in a major war. If a barrage were to get through and do damage, even to Israeli military facilities, let alone civilian facilities, you would suddenly see an explosion of violence in the region. So while I do accept James's point that anyone looking from the outside would say there is already a regional war occurring here, it's also important to say that it could get much worse. At the moment, what we're seeing are choreographed actions and reactions, a tit for tat, although it's becoming more serious and more frequent. An all-out war, there would be no warning at all about actions and reactions.
Well, let's move on to talk about the situation in Israel itself. There's been an explosion of violence in the country. Paul, can I stay with you? What's actually happened? Why has it happened? And How does this change at all Israel's sort of political direction over the next few weeks, the next few months?
Yes, I think it does. There are some in Israel, journalists and thinkers, who say Israel is actually fighting a war on four fronts, depending on how you count them. That's the north in Lebanon, the south in Gaza, with Iran and the Houthis, but also a home front. And that is to say that the country is divided, as it has been for a long time. And this week it exploded with the attempted arrest of several prison guards, reservists, who had tortured a prisoner. And their arrest was blocked, first of all, by their colleagues, or attempted to be blocked, and then whipped up by a civilian crowd, whipped up by members of the parliament, including ministers. And some in Israel described it as an attempted coup. I think that's probably a bit much, but it's certainly going in that direction. And it certainly illustrates how torn the country is. And there's a worry. Israel has already lost its status as a liberal democracy by some measure. It's now counted as an elective democracy. And there is some worry that it could really go down the road of becoming an ethno state. And for people like me who once worked in Israel on kibbutzes and who grew up supporting Israel from a sort of cultural perspective, it is really quite troubling.
James, would you like to come in there as well? What was your reaction to the violence? And has the state regained control?
I think it's regained control for now. I mean, over the 4 years that I spent reporting in Israel for the Telegraph, I noticed a real change in the kind of makeup of the society there. There's always been a deep schism in Israel between the secular liberal side of the country and the religious conservatives. The latter group very much now led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, a right-wing extremist who in the November elections of 2023 performed very strongly and has presided over what some perceive as almost a kind of state capture of the police. He's the national security minister. And he has a very large band of followers who, as Paul has alluded to, were involved in this very serious security incident earlier on in the week. I think that's always been a really long-term concern for Israel, that it's actually a deeply divided nation. And for a long time, what Israelis would say is, yes, we have an internal schism between these two groups, the secular liberals and the religious conservatives, but when there's an external security threat, everyone bands together, everyone mucks in, and we pose a united front. The problem with that assessment is that it doesn't feel or look very true when you've got a war being fought, basically, against Iran and to some extent Yemen and Gaza and Lebanon, and at the same time, you have this band of Ben-Gvir followers basically trying to break into a prison. It suggests that that united front is starting to look very shaky. And another big factor of this is that for many years, there's been this incredibly fierce resistance to Benjamin Netanyahu. He used to be such a beloved Israeli leader. Even Israelis who wouldn't vote for him would acknowledge in the past that from their perspective, he did great things for Israel, that he was a magnificent statesman. And there was a belief for a long time that he always had Israel's best interests at heart. Now his critics look at a war that's dragged on for 10 months, and they suspect a situation where the war is perhaps being unnecessarily prolonged in order to keep Netanyahu in power. It's kind of taken as a foregone conclusion that the minute this war is over, he will be removed as leader of the government. He's then not just got a corruption trial that he needs to deal with, which may lead to him being in prison for up to a decade, but there's also going to be a slew of potentially other kind of accusations, court cases that may be awaiting him in the context of the war that's been prosecuted. This is something that was going on long before the war. I mean, there were mass demonstrations against Netanyahu's leadership prior to this. There was a hugely controversial legal reform, which Netanyahu always said was about tightening up regulations in Israel in order to make the country more governable. But his critics said it was basically an attempted kind of coup, an attempt to neuter the judiciary. Israelis do care and did care very deeply about that prior to the war. That issue is not going away. It's a lingering source of tension in Israeli society. It speaks to a fundamental question of what kind of country they want to be, which Paul alluded to earlier. And this makes the society feel less cohesive, perhaps, than it's ever been. And it feels, in that sense, like a very dangerous moment, not just for the state of Israel, but for Israeli society.
And it should be noted that this could drag on for some time. The next election in Israel doesn't need to be held until October 26th. So that's still more than 2 years away. Now, it could be held earlier, but, this action, that Hamas started in October last year, has really caught the country at the worst possible time in the electoral cycle, because 2 years here is a long time without an election.
Paul and James, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important to mention?
I think one thing that really struck me about the Haniyeh assassination is that it kind of feels like there's a leadership vacuum in the Middle East at the moment in the context of the United States. The Biden administration says that it wasn't aware of this assassination, that it wasn't informed in advance. Now, that's not unprecedented. Israel tends not to alert its partners if it's doing a particularly controversial assassination of this nature. But I think there's a lot of concern that the United States is not showing leadership on this issue. We've all seen the reports as well about President Joe Biden's mental state and whether that could be a factor here. And it creates an impression where Western leadership feels a bit rudderless at the moment, basically, and that adds to the uncertainty and the anxiety about the future. For a long time, there was this view that Israel's more hawkish elements were being held in check by whatever US administration was in power at the time, that they would stop the Israelis from doing anything that went beyond the pale. Now, critics of Israel will point out that if you look at the scale of the death toll in Gaza and you look at the death toll and the civilian death in previous wars, that perhaps that's never been the case, and that's their view. But I think the United States has, by and large, played a role, not so much as a mediator, but as a partner of Israel that kind of holds them back from doing anything too escalatory. It doesn't feel like that's the case anymore, and that's another reason that this situation feels so dangerous.
Paul Nuki and James Rothwell, thank you so much for your time. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro claimed victory this week in an election that many said was far from democratic. While Russia, Iran, and North Korea were quick to congratulate Maduro, the rest of the world isn't so sure he has won the election, including the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who says that she has won the election. Our own Venetia Rainey speaks with journalist Simeon Tegel about the current situation in Venezuela.
Welcome to Battle Line, Simeon. Let's start perhaps on Sunday when we had the election. What happened and why have the results been contested?
So it seems there was massive turnout. Venezuelans have been waiting a long time for these elections. It's 6 years between presidential elections. And for all kinds of very good reasons, Venezuelans are desperate to get rid of their current government, their current president, Nicolas Maduro. And there was massive turnout. There also were all kinds of incidents on the day, intimidation by various Chavista organizations affiliated with the government, including colectivos, which are motorbike gangs that support the regime. But there appears to have been massive turnout, and the polls had been showing for months that the opposition was going to win overwhelmingly by a landslide. And hey presto, on Monday morning, Nicolas Maduro declared himself the winner with a narrow 51% of the vote, which frankly no one takes seriously. Two different polling companies, one Venezuelan, one American, Edison, are giving him 31% of the vote, having polled or surveyed thousands of voters across the country. And one of them is giving the opposition 66% and the other 65%, the opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, whereas the government is claiming he only got 44%. So no one believes this result. There's been widespread condemnation from the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, the Organization of American States, and also critically many other countries in Latin America, including some other leftist ones, Brazil, for example, Chile. The only congratulations for Nicolas Maduro's, in quotation marks, victory come from countries who I think are quite revealing. Russia, Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Iran. Oh, and North Korea, of course, and China.
Let's talk about Maduro then. Why are people so sick of him? What's the issue?
So he is the heir of Hugo Chavez, who came to power in the late 1990s. He was voted into power democratically. He was a former army officer who first risen to national fame in Venezuela in 1992 when he tried and failed a coup attempt against the democratic government. He died from cancer, we think in 2013. It might actually have been in 2012. His last re-election, he might have already been dead. We never get to the bottom of that. But his anointed heir is Nicolas Maduro, who at the time was widely expected not to last in power. The economic collapse that has ravaged Venezuela had already started. But Maduro, who's in his 60s, he's a former bus driver and union leader who then became foreign minister under Chavez, has been in power now for more than a decade. And during that time, Venezuela has just collapsed economically. It's worth noting it's the only country in the world with larger oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. Those are the official declared reserves according to OPEC, no less. Yet there's widespread hunger. Hospital patients die routinely because of a lack of basic medicines. It's, for example, not a country where you would want to get cancer. And the economy is just a basket case. There have been all these subsidies, clientelism, giving away food, TVs, other things to the poor. Initially, I think possibly you could say for the right motives, but it then became over time just this corrupt method of maintaining support for a government that has lost all legitimacy even before these elections, I think. And at the same time, cracking down on anyone who dared question the government. The media have been completely co-opted. Newspapers, radio stations, TV stations have all over the last 2 decades been taken over by the government, churn out pro-regime propaganda. And so for Venezuelans, you have to go online to YouTube and places like that to get any kind of real news. And the government has just now widely hated, including, and this is one of the interesting things about this election, by even the poorest Venezuelans who'd previously been the stronger supporters of the Chavista regime.
And so in the days since the election on Sunday, we've seen massive protests sweeping Venezuela. How serious is this? We've seen talk of a possible civil war, a revolution. The government are calling it a coup. What are we looking at here?
Well, it looks pretty serious. I think there's certainly a potential for these to be unprecedented protests that could go on for a while. It remains to be seen. But Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader, who was barred from running on really quite spurious reasons because she'd supported US sanctions on Venezuela, so a Chavista-packed court barred her from running.
She's Venezuela's Iron Lady, is that right?
That's how she's often described. She is politically, or economically certainly, you would say a Thatcherite, and Margaret Thatcher is one of her heroes, although the opposition alliance she leads is much broader than that. I mean, ideologically, it covers probably the spectrum of the current British Parliament. But she's charismatic, she's fiery, she's brave and determined. There have been all kinds of attempts to stop her from campaigning with the official candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, this retired diplomat who's 74, who she basically named, and he's basically been happy to act as her proxy. So Venezuelans voted for him with the idea that they would get her. She would be the de facto president if he were to win. I mean, it looks like he did win, but not officially, of course. But she has really managed to galvanize support in a way that Venezuelans possibly haven't seen in a generation. She's very popular. It's been quite moving, actually, to see her campaigning across the country. By road, she's been banned from flying, and just Venezuelans of all classes coming out, very emotional, just incredible crowds that have come out to support her. And I think she's going to be leading a really sustained attempt or sustained movement of mass protest against the government. There's already been violence. Something like 16, 17 people have been killed, including one soldier, apparently, across the country. But possibly this is a breaking point, or certainly a critical point in Venezuelan history. Up till now, the regime has managed to keep the army and the police on side, high salaries, all kinds of benefits to them. But is this possibly the final straw for them? The writing would appear to be on the wall. The government's lost any sense of legitimacy. I think that's really the key point. Are the military, the security forces, are they still on the side of the regime? Are they even prepared to use force, shed blood to put down these protests? Or at some point, is it going to be called into question in the next few days and weeks?
And what are Edmundo and Maria, these opposition figures, what are they offering as a solution? What do they want to do? What are they offering Venezuelans instead of Maduro?
There haven't been that many detailed policy proposals. I think that's in part because the opposition, ideologically speaking, is so broadly based. But the biggest thing they're offering, which most Venezuelans are desperate for, is to kick the Chavistas out of power, kick Nicolas Maduro out of power. But just to give you an idea of the lack of detail so far, it's really not clear what kind of transitional justice there might be. I think most Venezuelans, and certainly Maria Corina Machado, would love nothing better than see Nicolas Maduro in the dock. But we don't know whether or not they're actually planning to do that, or whether they might be willing to offer some kind of amnesty just to get him out of the presidential palace.
In the dock for what?
Crimes against humanity. There have been all kinds of serious human rights abuses as the government's repressed dissent, corruption, kleptocracy. I mean, billions of dollars of public assets, resources, money have gone missing. But even if there were an agreement with the Venezuelan opposition, that might not be enough for Nicolas Maduro. The International Criminal Court is now investigating him. The first time this has happened in Latin America to a Latin American leader. They're investigating him for alleged crimes against humanity. But separately, the United States has a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head for drug trafficking, because Venezuela has become a hub of cocaine from the Andes up to other parts of the world, especially the United States. So even if there were a transitional agreement or an agreement that would allow Maduro to stay out of jail in Venezuela, how would that affect the International Criminal Court? Would the United States be willing to waive its criminal investigations of Maduro to allow a democratic transition in Venezuela? So there's many unanswered questions about what, if the opposition does manage to force the Chavistas out, what the new government would actually look like and what it would do.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.